Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for the Alternative Factor, which is episode 28 of season 1 of Star Trek The Original Series. This video is a part of Star Trek Week, where I will be reviewing one episode from each of the 5 Star Trek series with the theme of episodes that I like that everyone else seems to hate. In this video, I will tackle the much-panned episode, The Alternative Factor. So the Alternative Factor is the episode in which, on a routine survey of a planet, the Enterprise encounters a galaxy-wide phenomenon where the universe seems to blink into nothingness. Kirk is then contacted by Starfleet that informs him that this phenomenon is centered on the planet that they are orbiting, but could destroy the entire galaxy. So Kirk beams down with the landing party to discover one man with a spaceship, and this man calls himself Lazarus, and he behaves very irrationally. He speaks of a murdering monster who he insists is not a man but a thing, and that is what is responsible for the near destruction of the universe. So Kirk brings Lazarus back to the Enterprise to interrogate him further, and he doesn't make much headway while this strange phenomenon continues. Meanwhile, Lazarus's behavior seems to fluctuate, where at one stage he seems a calm, rational person, and the next he's explosive and erratic. Lazarus, all the time, insists that Kirk give him the ship's dilithium crystals, claiming that they are the key to defeating the monster. Eventually, the crystals are stolen, and Lazarus claims he's not responsible. Later, more crystals are stolen once again, and this time Kirk and Spock deduce what is actually happening. That Lazarus is not one man, but two, which includes a version from a parallel universe that inadvertently met, driving one of them mad, and they met in this mergence of the two universes to fight in combat. However, if the mad Lazarus enters the other universe at a time of his choosing, it would cause the destruction of both universes. So Kirk teams up with the rational Lazarus to trap the mad Lazarus in between universes, and in order to do so, the rational Lazarus has to stay locked in between universes with the mad Lazarus at his throat forever. So they enact their plan, and it succeeds in saving the universe, but Kirk ponders that although they're safe, what of Lazarus? And what of Lazarus? So, I am going to be perfectly honest here. Had you asked me when I was a teenager back in the 90s what my favorite original series episode was, I would have named this episode as my favorite episode from the original series, as I absolutely loved this episode and would watch it repeatedly. Although I haven't considered it my favorite episode for many years, I still look back on this episode fondly. When I did my original series top 10 video 6 years ago, this episode didn't make it. However, I plan on doing an updated version of that soon, and to be honest, I'm not sure if this episode will make my top 10. Probably not, but I'm pretty sure it would make my top 20 list, because watching this episode again for this review, I found it just as awesome, suspenseful, engaging, and thought-provoking as I remember. If anything, watching this episode again has got me to appreciate it even more. However, something I started to notice in the last decade was that the episode has grown a particular hatred amongst the fan base. At a convention once, fans voted upon which episodes from all 5 series were the worst, and this episode made the top 10 worst list. On IMDb, it has a user rating of 5.9, making it the 4th lowest rated original series episode on that site, only coming above the episodes Spock's Brain, The Way to Eden, and The Children Shall Lead. And I looked up some reviews of this episode in preparation for this review and found several. All of them trashed this episode as an incoherent, boring, poorly constructed mess. But honestly, I personally was really puzzled why so many people look on this episode so negatively, because not only would I say this isn't one of the worst episodes, I'd say it's one of the best. So while many would claim this one of the worst episodes, I'd say that they're at the very least 50 other original series episodes that are much worse than this one. In fact, all the episodes I plan to review this week on episodes that I like that everyone else seems to hate, this episode has the biggest disparity in how much I like it and how poorly it is received. So, I looked up the reviews because I was genuinely interested to learn why this episode received so much hate, and I also found this message board where someone similar to me was genuinely puzzled as to why this episode received so much hate, and asked the question, why do people hate this episode so much? To which this user got a lot of responses. Some of them were too long, didn't read responses, while others were more concise with their bullet points. But there were a lot of different replies, and the OP replied to these responses by saying that they all make some good points to make them think. And this user was far more gracious than I would have been, as I don't think that they made good points at all. And it appears more to me that they have a bias against this episode because it has apparently become trendy to hate on it. Because here's the thing, if you watch this episode in a vacuum, watching it in modern times while not being exposed to any other TV shows or movies from the 60s or earlier, and you watch this episode alone without watching any of the other episodes from the original series, and then you read the complaints that the detractors had on this episode, they would appear to be perfectly valid, and indeed make good points against this episode. However, problem comes in when you consider all of the original series, and for that matter consider the time period in which it was made. Because the thing is, all of the complaints leveled against this episode would apply equally to pretty much every single episode of the original series. So let me name a few of these complaints, one of them being that this episode used junk science in regard to there being one universe of matter and the other of antimatter, and when they meet, this would cause the destruction of both universes, many stating this fundamentally misunderstands how matter and antimatter work. Well, first off, I would argue that when they used the terms matter and antimatter in this episode, they were speaking metaphorically and not literally. But even if you don't think that's the case, or you don't think it matters because a lot of other science used involving the tear between the universe is junk science that falls apart, well, I would remind you that this is the original series that we're talking about. Complaining about junk science in the original series is kind of like complaining about violence in a Quentin Tarantino movie. Of course there's fucking violence. It's a goddamn Quentin Tarantino movie. What did you expect? And the same thing with the original series episode. Of course there's junk science. It's the original series. Or are you basking in the scientifically accurate episodes like the Immunity Syndrome, where a giant amoeba starts to eat the entire galaxy, or Mirror, where the Enterprise discovers an exact duplicate of Earth with no explanation whatsoever of how it got there. It's just, there's 20th century Earth, no reason. Or Who Mourns for Adonis, where they discover an alien race who had posed as Greek gods that send a giant hand in space to seize the Enterprise. Or The Savage Curtain, where the Enterprise encounters Abraham Lincoln floating in space. Do I need to go on? Anyway, I could go on forever, and I could probably name all 78 other episodes. But I think I made my point, and that is, it's a useless argument because it could apply to literally any of the 79 original Star Trek episodes. Now, the other common complaint I heard leveled at the alternative factor is that Robert Brown, who plays Lazarus, is gives an over-the-top performance to rival that of William Shatner. Are you fucking kidding me? You're complaining about overacting in the original series? Why not just complain that the original series takes place in space? I mean, I literally couldn't believe the words I was reading on my computer screen, because if you think Shatner is the only overactor ever on Star Trek, then you are behaving like someone who has never freaking seen this show before. Now, I could go on with more examples of complaints that would apply equally across the entire original series, but I don't want this video to go on forever, and I think I made my point. For example, another common complaint is that the crew make a lot of dumbass mistakes letting Lazarus roam around the ship freely without a guard. In this instance, I could draw many examples of this happening, not just from the original series, but more of the modern spin-offs like Next Generation and Voyager as well. So again, this complaint does not hold up. But in the interest of time, let me now move on to those complaints that don't necessarily apply across the whole original series. One being that this episode is boring. Now, boring is a really subjective term, so one can't really argue that something is or isn't boring because what is boring changes from the eye of the beholder. In this case, I would only argue that I personally find a barrage of episodes far more boring than this one. So here's a list of a few episodes I think are more boring than this one. The Man Trap, Charlie X, Mud's Women, What Are Little Girls Made Of, A Dagger of the Mind, This Side of Paradise, The Devil in the Dark, Operation Annihilate, and that's just in the first season alone. I could go on to cover all the seasons, but again, I don't want to ramble on for too long. Point being, I personally and wholeheartedly disagree with the assertion that this episode is boring. In fact, I would say this is a very intelligent episode that, although uses junk science, but as I said, it's an original series episode, that just should be a given and shouldn't even be mentioned, kind of like stating that the Pacific Ocean is wet. But still, the scenario it sets is a very intriguing one, and I have to say the reason why I was attracted to it was because I was totally captivated by the mystery it presented and thought it really delivered on the payoff. What does set it apart from most other original series episodes, however, is that its plot is complex and not easy to follow and requires one to use their brain. And this, I think, is the actual turnoff for many of the normal original series watchers who are impressed by fluffy balls of fur that purr, or a fat guy making jokes while trying to pimp off hot chicks, or a contrived excuse to have a gun-blazing western with wide ARP, or seeing Abraham Lincoln fight Genghis Khan in hand-to-hand combat. And well, again, I could go on. Suffice to say, I personally find this was one of the more thinky episodes of the original series. So much so, I was really impressed by it. In fact, if you think that it was the first time, think of it, it was the first time that they used the parallel universe storyline in Star Trek. And it seems to me that the producers, after seeing how poorly received this episode was, decided to dumb down the approach to a parallel universe storyline that it might attract more viewers. So they decided to have Kirk and crew simply beam over to an evil version of the Enterprise where Spock had a goatee, because that would be an easier pill for the masses to swallow. Now, don't misunderstand me here. I'm not intending to badmouth Mirror Mirror, because I do believe that it is a classic episode and one of the best of the original series, and I would definitely say Mirror Mirror is a better episode than The Alternative Factor. But I can't help but feel it's an indicator that this episode was too cerebral for the mass audiences to follow. So another complaint I've read a lot when researching this episode was people bring up the fact that John Drew Barrymore, father of Drew Barrymore, was originally cast to play Lazarus, and he simply didn't show up when it was time to film. So they literally had to recast Robert Brown at the last minute to play Lazarus, and he only had a day to prepare. So the haters bring this up for several reasons. First, to point out that John Barrymore recognized how much this episode sucked, which is why he refused to show up. Which, by the way, led to him being prevented from working for over a year by the studio for doing this. But the thing is, we have no idea why he refused to show up. You'd think if it was because he hated the script that he wouldn't have agreed to take the role in the first place. Maybe he had a family emergency. Maybe he was high on cocaine. Maybe he fell in love and ran off with a woman. Who knows? Point is, no one knows why he didn't show up. So to say it was because he hated the script is nothing but pure speculation. And even if that is the case, so what if one actor hated the script? Harrison Ford hated Blade Runner, and yet that's a beloved movie. So that doesn't really mean anything either. And the other reason why they bring this up is to say that it shines through in the finished product, as you can tell that it was rushed and it's just a hodgepodge that was just thrown together very quickly. And this leads to a bigger issue that I've talked about before with movies like X-Men Apocalypse or Suicide Squad, where the public will get wind of some behind-the-scenes difficulty, and then they will then let this knowledge influence their viewing of the movie or episode, and thus inject this information into the movie inadvertently and look for signs of this trouble existing in the film. And in my opinion, this will often they will often invent mistakes that don't exist based on this knowledge. I believe a lot of critics did this to Star Wars Rogue One because they were aware that the film underwent last-minute reshoots, and therefore they conjured mistakes in their minds of the film being a mess or a mismatch, whereas to most mass audiences who saw this didn't notice anything wrong with it and quite enjoyed the film. Such as with The Alternative Factor, where I have repeatedly watched this episode over 50 times over the span of several decades, and I never noticed anything in the episode itself that would lead me to believe that the actor was cast at the last second, or that this was rushed or a hodgepodge mess. Now, let me be clear at this point. If you don't like this episode, I'm not trying to demean your opinion. Everyone has different tastes based on their experiences and personal preference. I'm not trying to say yours is any less valid than mine. But I do believe as human beings, we do let external factors shape our opinions. Another example I'd like to use is the J.J. Abrams reboots, as there was a lot of controversy leading up to the release of his second film, Into Darkness, including Benedict Cumberbatch very noticeably lying about the nature of his role that he was playing. And so when Star Trek 2009 was met with critical praise, Into Darkness was met with critical scorn. However, Star Trek in 2009 featured just as many flaws, cheap homages, poorly constructed characters, and nonsensical leaps in logic as Into Darkness did. In fact, I would argue even more so. But because of the bad press Into Darkness got before its release compared to the positive press 2009 got before its release, all these flaws in 2009 the critics completely ignored and were willing to forgive or gloss over, whereas these same flaws in Into Darkness they all of a sudden were willing to jump all over and tear apart. And I'd say this phenomenon happened when comparing the two comic book blockbuster movies that came out last year around the same time, Captain America Civil War and X-Men Apocalypse, where one film had positive buzz and the other had negative buzz. And as such, in one film the critics were willing to completely ignore its film's flaws, while in the other example the critics were willing to jump all over every single flaw and rip it to shreds. And I would suggest something similar with The Alternative Factor, because it has been decided this is one of the worst original series episodes. People are more likely to let this subconsciously influence their viewing of this episode, which is why people are more willing to jump all over this episode for flaws that are repeated throughout the entire original series. And I would suggest that the negative buzz of this episode originated from its more complex and slow-paced nature, where it doesn't have the simple childlike accessibility that most original series episodes have. Now, you may be saying at this point, now wait a second, Mark, you're accusing me of letting my experience with this episode influence my opinion, but couldn't the same be said of you? Since you loved this episode as a teenager, couldn't that influence and affect your opinion and blind you to some of the show's flaws? And if you said that, well, frankly, you'd be totally and absolutely correct. You'd be right. We're all human beings. We can't help but be subconsciously influenced by external factors. And the fact my introduction of this episode was a lot more positive, and I didn't hear about any of this negative buzz until years after I saw this episode, probably does have a lot to do with why I have a much more positive outlook on this episode. So now that I spent a really long time addressing the complaints of this episode, let me finally get into why I like it and what I think of it. Now, personally, I was captivated by this episode because it starts with a strange, unexplained phenomenon that is capable of destroying the entire universe. Now, this is sometimes easy to forget when looking back on the Star Trek franchise as a whole, but the original series rarely featured an episode with this high of stakes. Sure, by the Voyager Enterprise times, Earth or the entire Federation seemed to be put in peril every other minute. But in the original series, there are only a handful of examples where Earth or the Federation was put in mortal danger. Doomsday Machine, the Changeling, and the aforementioned immunity syndrome are a few of the examples out there. And I found the manner Earth was put in danger to be really fascinating. An unexplained tear in the universe, and they would go to the source of the investigation of this rip, and they find a madman ranting about some bloodthirsty monster. So this right here sets up a very intriguing, interesting mystery that had me well invested on pins and needles to learn more about what was going on, as nothing seemed to add up. And the more the episode went on, the deeper the mystery went, as Lazarus's behavior became more erratic and nonsensical, and we got these cool-looking psychedelic scenes of two men fighting each other in some otherly dimensional setting every time the universe starts to tear itself apart. I mean, this is, in my opinion, some really compelling, captivating stuff. And then seeing Kirk and Spock put the pieces together and solving the puzzle was amazing. While they realize it involves two men from a parallel universe battling each other, one has gone mad, and if they meet outside this tear, it would destroy both universes. I mean, this is some really fascinating stuff. Now, granted, this episode came out before episodes like Mirror Mirror, so the existence of parallel universe wasn't as commonly known. However, watching this episode with that knowledge, I must say this is actually a more inventive use of that plot device. And then the final payoff with Lazarus, the rational Lazarus volunteering to trap himself in an eternal struggle with a madman in order to save the universe was a deliciously dark and foreboding ending, with Kirk feeling sorrow and gratitude for the sacrifice that Lazarus made in order to save the universe. It had a nice touch of tragedy to it, in my opinion, an extremely satisfying ending. Like Kirk's final line, and what of Lazarus, I think is one of the most classic and defining lines of the original series, mainly because of the weight behind this line that the plot gives it. And as for Lazarus himself, yes, one can't deny that this performance is over the top, but as I already mentioned, this is par for the course for the original series. But more than that, I actually felt it was quite fitting for this story. If any original series episode uses over-the-top performances correctly, I'd say it was this one, as the whole point was to show a madman who had lost his mind. And yes, it does go a little over the top sometimes, but instead of poo-pooing all over it, I simply have fun with it. Like lines like Lazarus screaming, "Run, run, it will do you no good, I'll chase you to the very fires of hell!" Yes, it's over the top and cheesy, and that's why it's so perfect. It's so much fun. I love it. Anyway, another huge positive for this episode for me is the only appearance of Lieutenant Charlene Masters, who was an amazing character, and I dare say her importance to the show is often overlooked and understated. Scotty didn't appear in this episode. Instead, Lieutenant Masters was acting as chief engineer, an African-American woman, a lieutenant and chief engineer. This was a huge step in the original series. When examining strides the original series made towards race and gender equality, people often focus on Lieutenant Uhura, and don't get me wrong, her role was vital, particularly for being a recurring character, a black woman working on the bridge as an equal to the white male officers. But let's be honest here, up to this point in the original series, women were only portrayed as getting coffee or answering the phone, and they all had like soft-spoken, frail demeanors that often their only purpose was to service the men. Lieutenant Masters was a huge breakthrough in that, as although she was dressed in the same scantily manner as all the other women on the ship, I'd argue she was the first woman whose appearance wasn't solely intended to emphasize sexual appeal. And more than that, rather than servicing the men, she was the head of her department and had men working under her, which was a huge statement to have this on a network television where she had a white male assistant who took orders from her. And not only that, but rather than have the sweet little old me eyes that most other women that appeared in this show had, she was smart, she was no nonsense. When an engineering was going up in smoke around her, she showed devotion and rushed to her station and, refused to leave in the face of danger. Call me silly, but I thought this was an amazing character and she should have become a series regular, and I suspect that the reason that she didn't was because of the blowback from the network once they realized what they allowed to air on network TV. So I salute you, Lieutenant Masters. In fact, apparently the original idea was to have a romance between Lazarus and Lieutenant Masters. However, Gene Roddenberry was against this, as the episode that aired shortly after the episode Space Seed, which also saw a lieutenant falling in love with the main antagonist. And so he felt this was too repetitive to repeat the same beats. And as much as I would have loved to have seen an interracial romance portrayed on the original series, which it wouldn't actually tackle until its third season, I do agree with Roddenberry that this would have been too repetitive, and Masters came off as an even bigger badass because of the lack of romance. However, I am not going to lie and say that this episode has no flaws. The biggest one for me has always been the revelation of their being two. Once the revelation of their being two Lazaruses is revealed, if you go back and watch the episode with this in mind, I find it doesn't completely add up, as one is supposed to be more rational than the other, and the other is supposed to be crazy, where both versions act crazy in some way at pretty much all times. Now, the argument could be made that he was pretending to be crazy just to blend in with the other Lazarus. However, Kirk himself in the episode notices that one is more rational than the other, which doesn't actually jive with what we've seen. And I have to admit, even I laughed at certain scenes like Lazarus falling off the cliff, where it was so noticeably a fake dummy. It was just so laughably bad. And that the fake Lazarus's beard constantly shifts from being thin, almost non-existent, to being completely full and bushy. And no, before you say it, it doesn't match up with there being two different versions of Lazarus. It's completely random, and it goes through various states and sizes. But again, stuff like this is par for the course for the original series, like episodes like the Galileo 7 that has a guy dressed in a college mascot costume throwing giant balls of styrofoam at people and they acting like it hurts when it hits them. That's the original series for you. You just have to take that into consideration. So my rating for the alternative factor out of 10 is a 9. Excellent. Although I didn't like this episode as much as I once did, I still really enjoy it, and I disagree wholeheartedly with the common opinion that this episode was poorly executed. It always came across to me as a well-constructed mystery story centering around a strange science fiction phenomenon. I find many of the common criticism leveled at this episode invalid because it could also apply very equally to any episode from the original series. Although I admit it's not a perfect episode, as some parts involving the Lazarus character weren't executed as well as they could have been, it still comes off to me as a fascinating story with a dark and foreboding ending. So that's it for my review of The Alternative Factor. Please be sure to join me as I continue with Star Trek Week, where I review an episode from each of the 5 Star Trek series with the theme of episodes that I like that everyone else seems to hate. Also, check out my channel for many more Star Trek videos, as well as many other videos on shows like Game of Thrones, Vikings, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. Thanks a lot for watching.